Somewhere in the North Sea, a ship lowered a steel tube into the seabed and pulled up a column of mud about the width of your arm. Inside it, in a layer laid down more than 16,000 years ago, was the DNA of an oak tree. That should not be there. 16,000 years ago, this was supposed to be tundra at the edge of an ice sheet. Frozen, treeless, barely survivable. And for the last 8,000 years, it has been the bottom of the sea. That core was one of 41. Together, they contained 252 samples of sediment, taken along the buried channel of a river that has not carried water since before farming existed. And when a team led by the University of Warwick sequenced the ancient DNA locked in them, they found something that quietly contradicts the story almost everyone tells about this place. The place is Doggerland, and you have probably heard how it ended. You have heard about the wave. Around 8,150 years ago, off the coast of Norway, an enormous section of the continental shelf gave way. Geologists call it the Storegga Slide, from the Old Norse for great edge. The numbers are genuinely difficult to hold in your head. 3 submarine debris flows shifted roughly 3,500 cubic kilometers of sediment. That material spread across around 80,000 square kilometers of the Norwegian Sea floor, traveling more than halfway to Iceland. It generated a tsunami. That tsunami reached Scotland and Norway and the Faroes, and it left deposits that are still identifiable today. None of that is in dispute. It happened, it was vast, and for anyone standing on a shore in its path, it would have been the end of the world. The story usually told is that this wave is what killed Doggerland, that there was a land connecting Britain to Europe, full of people, and one morning the sea stood up and took it. It is a very good story. It has a villain and a date. The evidence does not support it. Let me be precise about what Doggerland actually was, because the popular version is thinner than the real one. When the last ice age was at its peak, so much of the world's water was locked up in ice sheets that global sea level sat well over 100 meters lower than today. The shallow basin that is now the North Sea was not sea. It was land, an enormous plain stretching from the east coast of England across to Denmark and the Netherlands. It had rivers. It had hills. Its lowest ground is now the Doggerbank, a sandbank that trawlers still snag their nets on. And people lived there. We know because fishing boats keep dredging up the evidence, worked flint, antler harpoons, the bones of animals that only live on land. For a long time, it was described as a land bridge, a corridor, somewhere people walked across on their way to becoming British. Professor Vincent Gaffney of the University of Bradford, one of the authors of the new study, puts the correction like this. For many years, he says, Doggerland was seen as significant only as a route for the settlement of the British Isles. Today, we understand it was not just a heartland of early human settlement, but a refuge for plants and animals, and a fulcrum for how prehistoric communities settled and resettled northern Europe over millennia. Not a corridor, a country. So how do you read the ecology of a country that has been underwater for 8,000 years? You drill. The technique is called sedimentary ancient DNA, DNA. Ordinarily, to know what grew somewhere in the past, you look for pollen, which survives well and is identifiable under a microscope. But pollen has limits. It travels on the wind, sometimes for hundreds of kilometers, so finding it does not prove the plant was actually there. And plenty of species are poorly represented in the pollen record. DNA works differently. As organisms live and die in a place, they shed genetic material into the soil, from roots, leaves, feces, decaying tissue. In the right conditions, particularly waterlogged and oxygen-poor sediments, fragments of that DNA persist for tens of thousands of years. Sink a core into the right seabed, and you get a stack of those layers in order. Deeper is older. Sequence what is in each layer, and you can reconstruct, step by step, what was living there. That is what the team did. 252 samples from 41 cores, taken along the course of a prehistoric watercourse they call the Southern River, chosen because its sediments were unusually well preserved. Between them, those cores span from roughly 16,000 years ago through to the moment the North Sea closed over the top. Here is what came out. Oak, elm, hazel. Temperate woodland trees, present thousands of years earlier than the pollen records from mainland Britain would suggest. Lime, tilia, a tree that likes warmth, showing up around 2,000 years before it appears on the British mainland. And then the strange one. The team recovered DNA from Pterocarya, a relative of the walnut, which was believed to have vanished from northwestern Europe roughly 400,000 years ago. It had not vanished. It was still there, in the middle of what is now the North Sea, hundreds of thousands of years after the textbooks had written it off. The reason that matters goes beyond one surprising tree. There is a long-standing puzzle in ecology called Reid's paradox. When the ice sheets retreated at the end of the last glaciation, forests spread back across northern Europe far faster than they should have been able to. Trees are slow. Seeds do not travel far. Run the numbers on how quickly oak actually spreads, and the recolonization of Europe looks impossible. The proposed answer is microrefugia, small, sheltered pockets where temperate species clung on through the cold, much further north than anyone assumed. If those pockets existed, the forests did not have to march north from the Mediterranean. They were already close by, waiting. Doggerland's oak, at 16,000 years old, is a microrefugium. As Alibi's team put it, this is evidence of early colonization before inundation, consistent with northern glacial refugia. There is a human consequence, too. Woodland means resources, timber, nuts, and animals that live in forests, boar among them, which means southern Doggerland could have supported people thousands of years before the well-documented Mesolithic cultures we usually associate with the region, like the Maglemosian around 10,300 years ago. Professor Alibi's phrasing is careful and worth repeating exactly. This, he says, is the best evidence that Doggerland's wooded environment could have supported early Mesolithic communities prior to flooding, and it may help explain why relatively little early Mesolithic evidence survives on mainland Britain today. Read that second half again. The reason we find so little of these people in Britain might be that they were not primarily in Britain. They were out there, under the shipping lanes. Which brings us back to the wave. In 2020, a team including Gaffney published a paper in the journal Antiquity with the title A Great Wave, the Storegga Tsunami and the End of Doggerland. And the question mark is doing real work. They presented the first evidence of the tsunami from the southern North Sea. And what they concluded was that by the time it arrived, most of Doggerland was already gone. Not gone in a wave. Gone in the way that land actually goes, under rising water, gradually, as the ice sheets melted and the sea came up. Over thousands of years. What the tsunami hit was not a country. Part of the Dogger Bank was still above water. So was a coastal plain and a scatter of islands along what is now England's east coast. Real places, with real people on them, and for those people, it would have been catastrophic. But it was not the end of Doggerland, because Doggerland was mostly already sea. Their conclusion was that traditional notions of a catastrophically destructive event may need reconsideration, and the new core data goes further. The Warwick team found that parts of Doggerland survived the Storegga tsunami, and that parts of the landscape were still above water as late as 7,000 years ago. More than 1,000 years after the wave that supposedly ended everything. Alibi's summary: evidence that the North Sea fully formed later than previously thought. So here is where the honest version leaves us, and I want to be careful, because the correction is not that the disaster did not happen. The Storegga Slide was real, the tsunami was real, and enormous, and lethal. The claim being corrected is narrower and more specific. It is that this event was the ending, that a country full of people was destroyed in an afternoon. It was not. What actually happened is stranger and much harder to film. The sea rose. It rose slowly enough that no one alive ever watched it happen, and fast enough that nobody's grandchildren lived in the same landscape they did. A river mouth becomes a marsh. The marsh becomes a bay. Ground you hunted as a young man is somewhere you can only reach by boat, and eventually somewhere you would not bother going at all. Nobody fled Doggerland. There was no last day, no survivors, no story passed down about the night the water came. There was just a very long, very ordinary retreat, generation after generation, each one making sensible decisions about where to camp, and each one with slightly less country than their parents had. It took roughly 200 generations. Somewhere in there is the last person who was born on Doggerland, and they would have had no idea. I should be straight about the limits of this evidence, because the whole point of preferring it to the flood story is that it is more careful. Seeded DNA is powerful, but it is not simple. DNA can move between sediment layers over time, which can make things look older or younger than they are. Contamination is a live concern. Detecting a plant's DNA tells you it was in the catchment, not precisely where it stood. And 41 cores along one buried river is a keyhole view of a landmass the size of a country. None of that undoes the finding, but it does mean the right posture is confidence about the direction and humility about the detail, which is exactly the posture the catastrophe story never adopts. And there is one more thing worth sitting with. We tell the wave story because it is a story. It has a shape, a place, a threat, a moment, an ending. The real version has none of that. It is a slow subtraction with no antagonist and no scene you could put in a film. But it is the version that actually happened to the people who lived there. And there is something worth noticing in the fact that we found the truth by drilling 41 holes into the bottom of the sea and reading the DNA of trees that died before writing was invented. The country is still down there, under the ferries and the wind farms and the fishing grounds. It did not drown. It was slowly, quietly taken away.